Welcome to My Life, Tanya Applied, with Rabbi Simon Jacobson, a journey into the deepest teachings of Torah and their application to our personal, emotional, and psychological lives.
A good tavach, a good week. We continue our journey in the life-changing Sefer Tanya. This program is made possible by Rena Lights LLC, and it's in honor and memory of Rabbi Yosef Alevi Weinberg Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Moshe Pinchas HaKohen Katz Olav Hashalom, Rabbi Yael HaKohen Khan Olav Hashalom, and in the schus and merit of Rabbi Zev Yecheskel HaKohen and Risha Katz La'erich Yom V'Shanim Tevis for many long, healthy years. We finished chapter 23, and we're now entering to chapter 24 of Tanya. So briefly, the Tanya, the structure, after chapter 17, chapter 18 and 19, the Alter Rebbe began talking about the dimension of Ava Mesuteres, the innate natural love that is there in every neshama, in every divine soul. This is regardless of a person's efforts and avodah and work. We're born with it. Obviously, it's dormant until we activate it, but it affects us. And the most immediate effect is in time of danger, or, as he put in time of crisis, when a person's faith is threatened with an ultimatum. Either bow, God forbid, to an idol, worship idol, avodah zarah, or it will put you to death, God forbid, so a Jew, he says, in most cases will choose not to bow to avodah zarah because it touches that very core. It's like when push comes to, so many times we can do all kinds of things, but push comes to shove, when you feel your life threatened or your family life, the real you emerges, so to speak. But that's in a particular situation, which tells us that even someone who doesn't contemplate or is unable to contemplate on the divine, like he spoke about in the earlier chapters, essentially from chapter 12 through 17. Person contemplates and can awaken a love for God, which in turn gives them the moyach shal ta'alev, the mind to control the emotions of the animal soul. Even if a person can't come to that, and not even to talumis libe, like he explained, which means you don't have full-blown emotions, but at least you're on a level of maturity where you recognize that it's worthy, God is worthy of being loved, even if you don't feel the love completely. Even if you're not on that level, but the fact that you have innate Ava Mesuteres tells you that Kodev Elecha Dover Meid. But how do you explain it in a time when there's no crisis? And that's where chapters 20 all the way through 25 come in. Where it explains because when you think about it, this idea of Ava Mesuteres, why is it that when a person is threatened, let's take an example, God forbid. Take a negative example. Parents and children. So naturally, healthy parents love their children. But at times, parents can be negligent. They can make mistakes. They're human beings. So you don't always see it in the most revealed way. But when the children are threatened, or there's a threatening situation, you suddenly see that profound love, which is there all the time, except you don't always see it. Because that connection is there. The same thing, Yidden and Neshama and Hashem are always connected. Ava Mesuteres. However, you don't see it all the time, because the soul did enter into a body, an animal soul, so it gets concealed, and the animal soul distracts us. But when there's an emergency, then you see it. When a person is threatened, they suddenly say, "Oh, you want me to disconnect me from God?" It's like the Alter Rebbe says elsewhere. A Jew, not he wants and not he's able to be torn away from God because he sees that it's his life. Other times he may not feel that. Friedrich Rebbe has an interesting example in a Maimer that's Tzadik Ches, I think. That, when a diver, not a scuba diver, there was the deep sea divers that go down into the water, and they have a pipe, oxygen pipe that connects them to the ship, that it's necessary for them to be able to breathe. Not in not not like scuba diving where you have a pack, an oxygen pack on your back. So the diver, when he's below, he knows all the time that he's dependent on this pipe that's giving him oxygen. And if God forbid it gets severed in any way limited, he can suffocate. But imagine he doesn't know. Now remember, we say Taryag mitzvahs are like life pipes. Chayenu v'erich yamenu. They are like these pipes that connect us to our very sustenance. So even if one is compromised, we may not feel it. That doesn't mean it's not a compromise. But as soon as you know, of course you'll do everything possible to live. Is that you don't always know, you're not always aware. So that's what chapters 20 and on come to explain. That when you become aware how divine unity permeates everything, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and the opposite also true, that anything that is outside of godliness is in the category of La'yil Lecha Lekim Acherim, is utter pirud, is the utter separation from the divine. When you recognize that, then it's not. Then a person's Kadav Elecha Davar made. You'll always want to be connected to your life source. You always want to be connected to that unity and not allow for anything opposite. So now, after explaining in chapter 20 and 21 and 22, the example he gave that the yichud of Hashem is through the dibur of the Hashem, that everything in existence comes from God's speech, and God's speech is one with him. So even when he speaks, so to speak, to create something outside of him, from God's point of view, nothing's outside of him. It's only due to the tzimtzumim, the concealments, so we don't see it. That's why it's possible for us to not feel the anochi and the la'yil lecha all the time. But as soon as you know that, you suddenly realize, not just in a time of emergency, that all the time you're connected to God. All the time the parents are connected to the children. And we don't need to wait for an emergency or a crisis to be aware of that. So that's what the Alter Rebbe explains in these chapters. We said, we're talking about a person who may not have the contemplation, may not even be capable, daitek tzara, like he said earlier, in the beginning of chapter 18. He's not capable of this contemplation. So there's talk of many levels. There's first just the bare awareness that everybody's capable of. The contemplation we learned earlier, before chapter 17 and earlier, there we're talking about someone has a mind and they're contemplating on God and God's greatness and all the different aspects of Mamala Kalam, Sevu Kalam, and Kula Kamei Kalachashiv, as he speaks back in chapter 3 in Tanya. Here, it's just the awareness that the divine unity is everything. And everything outside of that, duality, is the opposite. Now, what level can a person come to? That again comes down to who the individual is. Like he concluded the previous chapter, he said that ultimately, the highest level, Yira Gdela, as he called it, was a Yira that you recognize that when you learn Torah, you're one with Hashem. So it creates a tremendous element of reverence. So Torah brings you to such a Yira Gdela. But he says, Lav, but even so, when Lav Kol Meiches Sovel Da, not everyone can contain and relate to that type of level. Even someone who cannot, because we're talking about someone who may not be capable of that. Capable, not just he's not doing, he's not capable because his nafshe b'sharsha mekera is on a lower level. This higher level of yira, of recognizing how one is God, that one is through learning Torah, you're one with godliness, because Torah is chachmosiv v'tzein shel Kadosh Baruch Hu, like we explained in chapter 23. Whether this also refers to, probably not, but because Yira Gdei Zu is from Torah. But in concept, the same idea with mitzvahs, that they avoid in the malko, that through a mitzvah we become a vehicle when we do a mitzvah. So even if someone doesn't fully understand it, Ein Yirazu merkeves bei lemaisa. I still apply this to Torah, the Yira, because he's talking about the Torah. He says it very clearly. That Torah is higher than Tefillah and higher than everything. But in concept, it means that even if a person doesn't fully understand it, but it comes down to action, which is the most important, the fact is he's now aware that this is divine unity, is you are part of that. You may not feel it, because there's the tzimtzumim, but you're aware of that, so when it comes to Maisa, it's Karev Elecha Dover Made. But now we get to chapter 24, come to explain the other side of it. So let me explain with an introduction. Let's go back to the example with the children. When God forbid children are in danger, or someone you love is in danger, what's going on? What's going on is you sense that you must act, sense of urgency. Now it's not a time of playing around, there's no time of options. You have to save the life of the person. Same thing with your own life. When you feel threatened. But there's two aspects to it. One is because you love your life. And you want to be connected, you want to live. The other thing is because you realize now the opposite, the threat of death, God forbid, or danger, is threatening life. So there's essentially two sides to this. When you love something, you also love everything. You love something, you also despise everything that's the opposite of life. So for example, a person will say, I know that this is critical for my children to have, or for me to have, to be able to live healthy. But then a minute later, you eat something that's poisonous, while you're eating something that's healthy. It's not enough just to be committed to the positive connection, but you also have to negate the negative, because you can't have both happening at the same time. So indeed, that's what Anochi and La'yeh Lecha are. Why is there two mitzvahs? Why not just Anochi Hashem Elokecha? Yichud Hashem, everything is part of God's unity and there's no room for anything else. Because you also have to negate exactly that there's no room for anything else, and anything else separates you from God. So it's not just enough to connect to the life source, it's also make sure not to avoid connecting to other things that disconnect you from the life force. So it's like traveling on the road. It's not only enough to know what road to travel on, also what road not to travel on. Because we do live in a world where there are options and choices. So you can say, okay, I've chosen the right path, but you have to also know what to avoid. So in this contemplation, maybe that's not the right word to use in this context, but in this understanding and awareness, there's two sides to it. One is the recognition that everything is part of God's unity. And nothing is devoid of that unity. Torah and mitzvahs help us do that, because mitzvahs are vadim de malka. They don't have the hester ponim. They're not concealed. The mitzvahs are the limbs, the organs of the king. And when you do a mitzvah, you become a vehicle to that. Torah even more so, as we learned in the previous chapter 23. Torah is not just a vadim, he says, the malka. It's just a raisa v'kutshabrichu kulachad. When you're learning Torah, you are becoming, at that moment, literally a channel of godliness. Godliness is manifesting within you. And that's why indeed it brings to such a yira, like we said, a such high level of reverence. That's the positive side. That's the Anochi Hashem Elokecha, and all the positive mitzvahs are all nichlal, are all encompassed in Anochi Hashem Elokecha. But now we need to understand also the other way around, that everything, every loisaseh, the negatives, mitzvahs, are all part of La'yeh Lecha. Not just when you're threatened, every time, because 24/7, anything that is you go defy God's will is separating yourself from the reality of God. And that's what he's going to explain now in chapter 24. So we have then a beautiful picture of both sides of it. Here all the mitzvahs, all of them connect you, especially Torah, connect you to the divine reality, even in a world where we don't feel it initially because of the tzimtzumim, the concealments. And La'yeh Lecha teaches us that anything you transgress is literally separating yourself from the divine unity. It's an element of pirud. Not just Avodah Zarah, the Avodah Zara, but any leisaseh. So let's continue now. We're going to learn Perek Chav Dalet. V'zelo umazeh, he says. What does that mean? And God has made one opposite the other. What's the opposite here? In the previous chapter, we learned how Torah mitzvahs is tachlis hayichud, the utter unity with God, because they're not subject to any concealments, so they carry godliness into our reality where the divine is concealed. So everything is united. Now he's going to say how Avedis, so a mitzvah comes from the word connection, it connects you to that unity. Aveda comes from the word havara mereshus l'reshus. I'm adding that, he doesn't say that explicitly. Like, if mitzvahs is connections, Avedas are disconnections. Displacement. Dissonance. They're Avedas, they're tachlis hapirud from Erein Sof Baruch Hu. Every Aveda. So this goes back to explain that we don't have to wait when the person is threatened and says, here's Aveda Zara, and the person says, no, I won't do Aveda Zara because I feel my very connection to God is being compromised. But all the time, anything that God says do not do, it means that that by doing that, you separate yourself from godliness. So that's Zelo Umazeh. After explaining the positive of how through Torah and mitzvahs we unite, now he's going to explain Hein Shasam mitzvahs leisaseh. This is Zelo Umazeh, the opposite. These are the 365 prohibitions in the Torah, the leisaseh, the araisa, the Torah's prohibitions. V'chol isuri d'Rabbanan. And not just those that are written in Torah, but also the prohibitions by rabbinic law. Anything that is said, do not do, means because if you do it, you disconnect from godliness. Not just God is telling you, Gzeres HaKosov, don't do something. Let's go back to the example. When the diver is down below, not only does he have to do certain things to make sure that the oxygen flows and he survives, and is sustained, he has to also avoid certain things that can sever this connection. So everything has asay teiv and surmara. What you should do and what you shouldn't do. When we teach our children, we don't just teach them here's what you do to be healthy. You also tell them, here are the things you don't do because that makes you unhealthy. Now you'll say, what's wrong with just teaching the positive? Because like I said, you can do the positive and not know that you have to be wary and aware and cautious of other things. So you can end up mixing the two. Meaning having both. It's like sheres tevel v'sheres biyadeh is an expression. You're going to the mikveh, but you're holding a shed. It's a dead animal. Or a shed is something that's tameh, a dover tameh. So that's why you need both. That's the way you have the whole full picture. So what's the lumazeh? Hein shasam mitzvus leisaseh. The Raisa v'chol Yisur d'Rabbanan. And also the Yisur d'Rabbanan. Ma'acher. And he explains now why. And why they're the opposite of the positive. Why they're Lumazeh, like a mirror image, like the alter ego, if you wish. Because Ma'acher shein neged Ritzeinu v'chachmasi yisbarach. Because these Yisurim, both from the Torah and from the Rabbanan, are against God's will and wisdom. V'hofcha mamish, they're not just against, they're mamish the opposite, which is even more than just not. They express the exact opposite. So it's not just we say, I love life. You have to also reject death in every possible way, because it's the opposite. So he says like this, because they are reged tzeinei, v'hofcha mamish, heim nifrodim miyichudei v'achdusei yisbarach. So just like God says, here's what I want. And when you do that, you're connecting to His unity because you're connecting to what God wants. Through Torah mitzvahs. So here, it's the exact opposite, since He doesn't want it. And it's the opposite of what He wants. These are acts which separate you from God's non-dual and seamless oneness and unity. But tachlis hapirud mamish. And again, he emphasizes, like he said there, just like he said, neged tzeinei v'hofcha mamish, he says nifrodim, but tachlis hapirud, in a literal complete detachment, not just partial, complete. So Torah mitzvahs, chiyuv, the mitzvah, like we learned in chapter 23, are giving you essentially a pure, undiluted form of God's unity. Whether you're fully aware of it or not, or whether you understand it or not, but that's the fact. Because they're not subject to any diminishment and tzimtzumim. L'umazeh kam deloisaseh. That these all represent, when you don't do them, they represent a total rejection of anything that's not connected to God's unity. So essentially it's not just, you could say, okay, I followed all the orders that my authority, my king told me. But I also did some things he told me not to do. So there, yeah, you have some things that connect you with him, but immediately you did things that were also destructive in that connection, that undermine the connection. So here comes the second half that's telling you, avoid all the things God says not, because those things actually separate you from God. Classic example. Gam v'apu machtat rachmana karya. A ganav, the Gemara says in Brachas, the gifts of the Ein Yankiv, that a ganav, before he goes out to steal, he davens to Hashem to succeed. What is this? He's delusional. God said, "Lei signiv," do not steal. So he's asking God, help me do something you told me not to do. So Chassidus explains, because Amunah is makif. He's not delusional, and he's not lying. He does have Amunah. That's why he's davening. He's not faking it. But Amunah is makif. It hasn't been internalized, integrated with him. So he can do two things at once. Contradictory, paradoxical. He davens, that's a positive thing. And he goes to steal and doesn't realize. The ultimate is that you have to have the Anochi Hashem Elokecha of feeling God's unity and doing what God wants, but also not doing the opposite. And that's when you know that it's a complete picture, as he says here. So anything that defies God's will is tachlis hapirud mamish. So now, remember, the Alter Rebbe is coming to tell us that all Leisas is like lo yeh lecha lekim acherim, which is a big statement. How could you compare every transgression of a negative mitzvah to Avodah Zarah? We know Yarek Val Yavar, only Avodah Zarah, Shvichas Dam, and Gilui Arayis, you have to die for. There is a distinction. But in concept, there's something in common with all of them, because they all represent Avodah Zarah as in separating yourself from God. In halacha, obviously, there's levels of how much you separate and how much it affects you. But in concept, that's what he's going to say. So he's going to say like this now. That it's really that this tachlis hapirud, through transgressing a negative mitzvah, which is the tachlis hapirud against God in every possible way, it's utterly separate from God, is like the sitra achra itself and the klipa, which are called idolatry, avodah zarah, v'elikim acheim, and other gods. Like we learned earlier, machmas what? Machmas hester ponim shel rotzon elyon. Because the key thing is that because their existence is the hiding of God's face, of God's divine will, keniske le'il, as we discussed in chapter 22. Where he spoke about Elikim Acherim, what that means. Sitra Achra. So it's not just the Avodah Zarah itself, but anything that God says I don't want is a manifestation of that. So we're not just negating the idea of idol worship, God forbid, to worship something that's not God, another God, but anything that's not God's reality is already like Avodah Zarah. So if you think about it, it's unbelievable. Because you could say, you know what, I'll avoid the most dangerous situations. But other things, no. Anything that's not pure godly unity is the opposite. is the extreme opposite. And when a person knows that, then, as we'll learn, that helps them reach the Korav Elecha Dover Meid B'ficha V'lvav Chalasese, because their whole life is about connecting to divine unity. That's my source and my sustenance. Chayenu v'erich yameinu. That's my oxygen and my water, everything I need to live. And everything opposite is a suffocating, dangerous situation. It's like putting your hand in fire. If you're aware of that, even if you don't always feel it, but you're aware of it, that's essentially what means Korav Elecha Dover Meid, that you're living with godliness all the time. Now, obviously, realistically, every person has their level where they can reach there, but that's the concept. So, like we say, he's going to speak later. Why? You don't do an aveda except if you have a moment of insanity, a moment of shtus, of nonsense, of folly. Why? A person has aveda, he had a temptation. Because if you knew the damage the aveda does, the disconnect, you never do it in your life. If you knew, a healthy person, that you put your hand in fire, it gets burned, who would put their hand in fire? If you see someone putting their hand in fire, it's only because you don't know it's fire, or you don't know that fire damages you. So again, it's lack of awareness. So you don't need necessarily the biggest fire, the biggest danger, even a little, anything that's danger, anything that is not sustenance from the divine unity is the opposite. Okay, so that it covers the first opening of chapter 24. And then he's going to continue now to discuss that the pirud is not just fundamentally that you disconnect from God when you do something God says not to do, but it also affects your whole being. He's going to talk about how it affects, like we learned earlier, that when you do a mitzvah, it doesn't just affect the neshama, it's also the levushim, the levush hamaisa. And Torah, it's the levush hadibur and hamachshava. So the whole person is affected, either in the positive way that you're all part of an extension, a channel of divine unity, or God forbid, in the opposite, you become a channel for the divine, for duality, for the separation from the divine. That's going to be what he's going to talk about as we continue on the next section. But we'll stop here. Simon B'Tev, the key thing is to remember that we have the capacity to be divine consciousness through and through, recognizing this divine unity that we're part of. And then it's exciting, not just exciting, it's life-affirming to know. Like the Gemara says, Rabbi Akiva explains why you eat can't go without Torah. It's like water, like a fish out of water. A fish will never go out of water. So it's all about experiencing that water, the godliness. And of course, anything that's dangerous, the opposite would be the opposite of water. And with that will be Messiah. This is Tanya, every Motzei Shabbos, New York time, 10 p.m. TanyaApplied.com. A good tavach and be well.
This has been My Life, Tanya Applied with Rabbi Simon Jacobson. Please join us again next week. Visit ChasidusApplied.com for archived classes and more resources.